In this video, a close look at the Growtac Equal mechanical disc brakes and my experience with them so far on the Ritchie Outback over the past 9 or so months. Now, yes, they are ridiculously strong brakes, but there's actually a lot more to it than pure stopping power alone. So stay tuned to find out what I like and dislike about them. So these brakes came out within the past couple of years. I want to say mid to late 2022, but don't quote me on that. And they are a thing of beauty. They're machined from Duralumin, which is an aerospace grade aluminum. It's got some copper content in it, and it's just a stronger, more expensive alloy than your typical 6061. Now, they're really light at around 136 grams per caliper, which for reference is exactly what a GRX hydraulic caliper weighs. Now, I tend to be really particular about my brakes, and I like a light lever action with a very obvious bite point, smooth modulation, and lots of outright power. I know, it's a lot to ask, but the Growtacs seriously deliver in all of these areas. So let me just get this out of the way at the top here. The Growtac Equal brakes are far and away better than every other mechanical disc brake that I've tried, with maybe the exception of the Paul Klampers, to which these are very similar in my experience. Now, one of the things I really like about the Growtacs is that it comes with everything you need to install and set them up in the box. So you get the 2 calipers with the pads pre-installed, you get inner cables for both road and mountain bike style levers, you get a length of flexi housing as well as a long run of high quality compressionless housing. And you also get a flat mount adapter for the front and a bunch of couplers, ferrules, and mounting hardware in several lengths to suit a wide variety of frames. Now, the one thing you will need is an adapter for the rear if you plan to run a 160mm rotor like I am here on the Outback. Now, at the moment in early 2024, the complete Growtac brake kit is $365 from the US distributor Velo Orange. And if you add the rear adapter in for an additional $17, that puts you at $382 for a complete brake setup. Now, just for reference, the Paul Klamper, which again, in my opinion, is the only other purely mechanical disc brake that rivals a Growtac, starts at $244 per caliper, so $488 for the pair. And that doesn't include cables, housing, or adapters, which could easily put you over the $550 mark, give or take. So as far as price goes, I do have to give the nod to Growtac for being slightly more affordable, though of course still not what I would consider cheap. I mean, these brakes are a premium product, and in my humble opinion, the best mechanical disc brakes that money can buy. Now, as far as the design, I should mention that these are single-sided actuation, meaning that only one of the brake pads actually moves within the caliper. Now, this is the same type of design used in the Paul Klampers, and for mechanical disc brakes, it just makes sense. Now, it does mean that as you squeeze the brake lever, the moving pad will actually push the brake rotor toward the fixed pad. But the deflection in the brake rotor is negligible. I mean, we're talking on the order of 1mm or less of lateral deflection, and it really isn't as big a concern as some make it out to be. Now, of course, the counter argument is that dual actuated pads are more symmetrical and they don't deflect the rotor. However, in order to design a dual actuated mechanical disc caliper, which do exist on the market, you have to consider that the number of moving parts increases, the footprint of the caliper gets larger, and the weight likely goes up. So as with most things, there is a compromise to be made here, but in this case, I really think the pros of having a simpler, lighter, stronger brake easily outweigh the slight asymmetry to the caliper. Now, the install process is pretty straightforward, although I will admit that it's a little bit more involved than setting up a basic mechanical disc brake. And I say that for 2 reasons. Now, the first is just a combination of standard and flexible housing that you have to deal with. Now, ideally, you would use compressionless housing all the way back, but since drop bars generally have a pretty tight bend around the hoods, it makes fitting the included compressionless housing pretty tough just because it's so rigid. So the recommendation from Growtac is to use a short length of the flexi housing near the controls, and then to use a coupler to connect the compressionless housing for the remainder of the run. So you really do need a good set of cable cutters for the install because you will be making lots of cuts. Now, the second element that makes installation a touch more nuanced than a typical mechanical brake is setting up the variable leverage swing arm. Now, this patented component is essentially a cam, and depending on where you place it in its range, it'll affect the leverage profile at the brake. So I highly recommend reading the instructions about this particular component of the install. But in short, you definitely want to adjust the swing arm so that you never enter the danger zone at any point through the lever stroke. But aside from those two things, setup is actually pretty easy. And setting the pad gap is perhaps the most enjoyable part. Now you have a micro adjustment for each brake pad, and it's a stepless adjustment, meaning that you aren't confined to predetermined clicks like on other brakes. Now this means you can very precisely set the pad gap on either side of the brake rotor, and you can dial in the brake feel really easily. So of course the big question, how do they actually ride? Well, I probably made it pretty clear at this point, but the ride feel, it's just dandy. Now paired with the Shimano R7000 drifters on the Outback here, the lever action is incredibly light. In fact, if you check out my brake lever force video, I was actually surprised to find that these brakes have the lightest lever action of all my drop bar bikes. And that includes Shimano and SRAM hydraulic systems as well. And then while riding, the bite point is very pronounced, which is something that I really like in a brake. But at the same time, the modulation is really smooth. Now, I have heard from some that these brakes can feel very digital, as in they have a very on-off feeling, but I don't really experience that personally. Now, I would say that they modulate differently than a hydraulic brake, but there is certainly plenty of modulation in these brakes overall, and I've never felt that the Growtacs are a limiting factor in my riding to any extent. Now, as far as outright strength, I haven't done any scientific studies on brake force, although I am currently working with some of my students to develop a brake dynamometer for bikes. But anyways, the Growtacs have more power than I'll ever need. Now, my sort of go-to baseline test for any brake is if I can skid from a moderate speed using 2 fingers on the lever while seated. And then as a secondary test, I'll also see if I can endo with little effort as well. So yes, as if it needed restating, these brakes are crazy strong, or as Russ puts it, scary strong. Now, for all the things that I like about these brakes, there are a couple of nitpicky things about them that I could mention. Now, the first is that the pad adjustment screws are buried pretty deep in the caliper, so you do need a pretty long Allen wrench to adjust the brake pads. Now, this is maybe more a critique of the Vera Allen keys that I've recently been using, but these Allen keys are manufactured in such a way that the body of the tool has a larger diameter than the actual tool head, which makes it impossible to reach the pad adjusters on these brakes. So for this application, I resort to using my older Park Allen keys to make these adjustments. Now, another thing that I'm a little bit concerned about is that there are these rubber plugs that keep gunk out of the pad adjuster hole. But they're really tiny, and I've already lost one, and I feel like it's a matter of time before the other one is lost as well. Now, so far, I haven't had any issues with dirt and grime getting in there and affecting my ability to adjust the pads, but I do see that it could happen if you're not careful. And then the last thing isn't really specific to the Growtacs, but rather it's just a fact of life when you ride mechanical disc brakes. And that's the fact that you've got to adjust the cable tension and the pad adjusters pretty frequently to preserve a consistent feel at the brake levers. Cables stretch over time and brake pads wear down as well, so you do need to keep an eye on these adjustments, whereas on a hydraulic brake system, there are no cables, and the brake pads are designed to auto-advance as they wear down. But again, it's not really a gripe about the Growtacs in particular, just mechanical brakes in general. All right, well, there you have it, a look at the Growtac Equal disc brakes, a seriously well-engineered and well-executed product that I happily paid for out of pocket. Now, I've personally had 0 issues with them so far, and apart from dialing in the pads from time to time, they've basically been maintenance-free. Now, at some point, I would like to see how these perform as mountain bike brakes, where the demands of the braking system are higher. But until then, if you have any questions, just let us know down below. Thanks again for watching. Thanks again for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. I'll see you next time.